Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of Global Tantrum. As per always, I'm your host, Steve Pally. With me, as per usual, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. And with us in is our very special guest and friend of the show, Professor Andrew Lieber of Tulane University. And let's see, this is the second time you've guested on the show, Andrew. And I wish it were in happier circumstances. We brought you in because things have gone wrong in the Persian Gulf area this week. But you have great expertise, particularly when it comes to the Gulf monarchies. This week, everybody knows what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about what is now being called the Iran War, because that's what it is. That's where we're at, right, Galen?
To be fair, it is war with Iran,
It,
regardless of
yep.
what members of Congress will tell you.
Yes, that's right. Whether they call it a, what is it, special military operation, as it is in other places.
She was really on the other foot with that one.
Exactly. Yeah, we were thinking about doing an emergency pod when this kicked off. I believe it was on Saturday. Is that right? When
Yeah.
Israel and the United States started bombing Iran with the everything, including the kitchen sink. And we're now several days into it. Things have not slowed down much. If anything, they've sped up. We're going to get into all of that. We didn't want to do an emergency pod. We're not about hot takes on this show so much. We're about slow, boring takes. And we can be just as wrong being slow as we can being fast, right, Galen? So
Yeah, hopefully less wrong this way.
less wrong.
Yeah. I think a good way to start here is to lay out the case for and against doing this, and then we
I
can
agree.
open things up to a broader discussion. But first,
What's interesting is we both agree that there is in fact a case for doing this the way that it's been done, and you decided to take pro because it was harder. So I commend you
yes.
for that. I'll take con, which is a little bit more obvious, but there are reasons on both sides, and we're going to go into that because we think it's a good way to set the table. And then once we set the table, we're going to turn Professor Lieber loose a little bit
Yes.
and start asking him questions about what he sees going on, and we'll go from there. But yeah, take it away, Galen, please.
Yeah, first off, those of us that study the Middle East and nuclear weapons and security studies have been doing this exercise theoretically for 15 to 20 years. So
Yeah,
it feels a little surreal that it's actually happening. Look, I think at a very basic level, the case for doing this right now is that there is what IR scholars call a window of opportunity. Iran is as weak as it has been in a very long time. This is something we're going to ask Andrew about in just a bit, but somewhat to my surprise, at this moment in history, 2.5 years post October 7th, at a time when Israel's standing worldwide and in the Middle East is about as low as it's been, that Iran is the side that is largely isolated. And there's a variety of reasons for that. We can talk about whether countries like China and Russia are going to intervene. Spoiler, I very much doubt that.
mm-mm.
But their proxy network, their vaunted axis of resistance, has largely been decimated since October 7th, 2023. Hezbollah, which was always Tehran's kind of ace in the hole for deterring Israeli action, they've suffered enormous setbacks, particularly since late 2024. And Israel is now expanding operations, by the way, in Beirut, where Hezbollah likes to hang out, has ground troops crossing into southern Lebanon. Obviously, not the first time that's happened. Hamas has obviously been seriously degraded during this time. Iran still has some assets like Iraqi Shia militias and the Houthis in Yemen, but they've taken real hits. I forgot to mention the Assad regime in Syria, crucial Iranian ally, collapsed in late 2024. Beyond that, the war of last June, which I actually think this should be considered more as one ongoing conflict than a series of distinct ones, that really degraded Iranian air defenses. So that partially explains why the United States and Israel have more or less total command of the skies over Iran right now, which is enabling these enormous strikes and just crazy quantity of sorties. Like we're talking about World War II level conflict in some ways. Obviously, over the last few months, the regime has faced enormous protests. I have seen credible estimates of something like 7,000 deaths that the Iranian authorities perpetrated, as high as 30,000, something like
Right.
that. Iran is extremely economically weak at the moment. So the case for doing this is this has been a long-standing problem for American foreign policy. I think Trump has talked himself into trouble by saying last June that the Iranian nuclear program had been totally and completely obliterated. It's tough to justify doing this due to their nuclear program if you actually believe that. And we still don't know. We still don't know where that 900 pounds of 60% enriched uranium is, which is a wild card.
Mm.
But I think the case was stated pretty clearly by Secretary of State Marco Rubio a few days ago, which was basically, look, at some point, this is a government that's capable of building enormous stocks of ballistic missiles and cheap drones of the kind we've seen used extensively in the Russia-Ukraine war. And at a certain point, they're going to have so many of these things that we are going to be deterred from taking military action. And that's going to give them the cover that they want to resume their nuclear program and ultimately cross the nuclear threshold. And maybe you get lucky and you get regime change and you get a new sheriff in town that's friendlier to US and Israeli interests, and for that matter, to Gulf Arab interests. Or maybe you get something like the Venezuela model, which I think Trump said something to the effect of that would be the perfect outcome. So I think that's the case for doing it. I think there's a bunch of other reasons why this is happening, and we can talk about Israeli policy leading up to all of this. But
Mm-hmm.
I think if you were going to make the case for it, it would be that this is a hostile government that's been a major threat to US interests in the Middle East for a long time. It is largely isolated. It is weak at home with its people, and you don't want it to build up its ballistic missile and drone stocks. And so this is the window of opportunity to seriously set them back. If nothing else, this buys some time. And if you get lucky, maybe the problem is resolved via military action. I'm not saying that I agree with all of that, but I think that's the strong case for doing this.
Okay, I think that's well stated, and I agree with some of the points in there actually. And when all of this kicked off, I actually found myself wondering, hey, do I actually agree with this? Do I agree with the way this is going down? I'm glad that we didn't podcast right then, because I might have said that this has some interesting positive aspects to it. Now that we're, what, 5 or 6 days in, something like that, it is becoming clear what should have been clear all along. It is very unlikely that we are going to be able to satisfy any of our permanent objectives that you have cited from the air. And there's no indication, although Trump has muttered about all necessary measures and will be here as long as we need to be here. There's no indication that we're going to put boots on the ground to establish any of these objectives, whether those objectives are regime change, whether they're ensuring that the nuclear program is well and truly buried, like literally and figuratively, whether it is denuding Iran of these ballistic and drone capabilities, whether it is getting justice for the murdered protesters, which would be a nice thing to do. None of these things can be accomplished strategically from the air, most likely. Now, there's always a chance that if you roll the dice, good things happen, right? According to Rubio, which is what you've said, right? There's also a chance that when you roll the dice, really bad things happen, like the entire region goes up in flames, which is currently what is happening. There's also a chance that the Gulf monarchies get bombed and they lose their ability to produce and refine hydrocarbons, and they lose their status as safe havens or finance and tourism. It sets the region back decades. There's also a chance that the Strait of Hormuz closes for some period of time, and that spikes oil prices.
That's already happened.
That's in the process of happening. The question is how long it will continue to happen, and I'm sure that we'll get into that. It's the question to me becomes, was it worth these costs that are now steadily being imposed for the benefit of whatever temporary solution is afforded to the ballistic missile and drone and nuclear problems that we're going to get out of this? Because it's looking less and less likely that this is going to produce any kind of reformist government or a revolution, the Kurds getting involved notwithstanding. And so we are going to end up paying a high cost, and not just in military terms, like there's been casualties and there will be more casualties. And we're spending down all of our reserves in terms of our own missile and offensive capabilities to do this, by the way, not available in other areas. And the key limiting factor is actually the defensive capabilities that we're expending on the part of our allies that could be used in Ukraine and in East Asia, for instance, if things were to kick off there. But there are major costs in soft categories as well. We've started yet again a war in the middle of a negotiation. At a certain point, this makes it a lot harder to credibly negotiate with your enemies. This is number 2 against Iran. So why would the U.S. be able to negotiate with anybody going forward? They'll be expecting a sneak attack at this point. The U.S. started a war of choice without notifying any of its allies other than Israel. It's working in concert with Israel. So, of course, it notified Israel. But nobody else was aware of this. There was no effort made to build any sort of international coalition. One could argue that this was a total rug pull for the Gulf monarchies, who are supposed to be allies of the United States. This is typically not how you operate within an allied framework. So there are all of these costs that accrue to doing this. And it's not clear what kind of benefit we're going to get out of it. So that's my case for the con. I think it's a little bit easier to make than the pro, especially with the benefit of 5 to 6 days of war behind us and an indefinite future of war ahead of us. You know,
I just want to make one more point on what you said. Like, aside from this is like a core principle of security studies, people like doing regime change without ground troops solely from the air. Extremely
it's never been
difficult.
Done. Yeah.
And the other piece of this, like aside from the fact that it's the Iranian regime that has all the guns, and they have shown themselves in very recent memory willing to use those guns against their own people, there's no unified political opposition in Iran. Mm-hmm. There's no mass movement to rally around. And I would just add to your point about doing this in the midst of the negotiations, like that's something, by the way, we bitterly held against Japan on the road to Pearl Harbor. We'll get to this later, I'm sure, but you could argue this is a problem of our own making because the United States and Iran had a nuclear deal. Trump tore it up in 2018 without any plan for what should come after it. And I'd be curious to hear what Andrew has to say about this since he's spent time in Oman. The Omani foreign minister who was mediating these talks the day before the war kicked off said something to the effect that it looked like the talks were succeeding and there was a good chance that they might come off successfully. These are other reasons, in addition to all the pain points you identified, that Iran's going to be able to push on.
Yeah. Speaking of pain points, Galen, in conversations before recording this show, you and I agreed that there's 2 main levers that we've identified so far that will decide how this war is going to go and for how long it's going to go on. One of those levers is what's happening to the Gulf monarchies. The other is what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Let's start with the Gulf monarchies. Andrew, you're an expert in this area. They're getting bombed. And yeah. How much of a problem is this? Besides, yes, obviously it's a problem, but like how much more can they take before it's a real problem?
Yeah. So I think that's the $64,000 inflation adjusted question is how much longer? So thus far, I think if you wanted me to do both sides of the case for a place like the United Arab Emirates, the like bullish, the UAE is still doing great case would be, hey, we've demonstrated that our interceptors can keep people safe. People are still going about their business. people just working from home. We have remote learning going on, but it's a massive problem. I think that on the one hand, I think sort of the reporting can maybe make it seem, I don't know, like people are like panicking. I think people in whether it's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, people who are long-term residents, citizens of these countries, broadly calm, if certainly concerned. But these are also countries whose economies run on people, goods, and especially oil moving in and out quite a bit. We're seeing people, tourists who are stranded, people who are concerned about staying in the UAE and other countries long term, trying to take some of the few exits that are available, whether that means driving a long way to get to Riyadh or Muscat, I don't know, trying to charter a private flight or something. And even getting out of these remaining airports is proving increasingly difficult. So you have, I think last I checked, something like all of Qatar's liquid natural gas exports were on hold, and Qatar was actually planning to shut down their liquefaction of natural gas, which is a process that takes a long time to start up again. So you have these things like, I think Bahrain has, I forget which one, it's like a massive aluminum smelter that's being shut down, which will take several months to get hot enough to smelt aluminum again. So you're seeing these costs and concerns suddenly build up, and that for a day or two, for a week, there's an ability to manage at least what we've seen so far, but longer term contingency plans are coming into play. And then there's a longer term concern about what the non-oil economic model is of these countries. There's been a convergence around the Dubai United Arab Emirates model of, okay, we've got some oil wealth, but we'll use that to provide a tax-free haven to other companies. We'll present ourselves as a critical node that can be a broker for the United States or other powers to, say, Central Asia, to Sub-Saharan Africa. We'll let vaguely sketchy social media influencers from Central Europe buy very expensive property and let influencers hang out here. We'll host very sensitive data centers from the United States right in the middle of a potential war zone. Now it's an actual war zone, which is going to strengthen some of the voices in the United States against, for example, making the Gulf a critical part of the US AI supply chain.
Yeah, so implications. And we're only 5 or 6 days in. It sounds like, in your opinion, things are still okay. The leadership of these countries is able to keep people calm, paper things over. They still have interceptors, so they're able to hit these drones, the Shahed drones, out of the air. They're able to stop the short to medium range missiles coming from Iran. Maybe they'll get away with it. But on the other hand, all the airports are closed. The refineries, some of them have been hit, including Saudi Aramco's main refinery. It's my understanding was on fire as a result of a missile or drone strike. The shipping's not happening, and you alluded to this already. The problem is, if the shipping is not happening, the oil is not getting offloaded, and a lot of these places don't have very much storage. So they need to be able to shut this stuff down, because there's no place to put it. There's no place to put the oil, literally. Like Iraqi production is starting to shut down. And 20% of the world's oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz. Could be a big problem. How much longer? Maybe this is more of a gut sense than it is empirical, but like, how much longer do you think the Gulf monarchies can hold out? How much more can they take if this continues?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, I don't want to maybe come up as glib in my analysis because I'm hanging out in Washington, D.C., which currently is pretty relatively safe. But
Sure.
I think that there is definitely concern about these things happening. It's not fun for anybody. Obviously, much worse on the Iranian side, but even for a place like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, I don't want to suggest that everything is like truly fine. But I think we're already seeing some of the concern of governments on the GCC side of things, and that we're seeing the rollout of increasingly direct and harsh warnings about the legal consequences of sharing any photographs, videos, information about particular strikes. There's a desire to have complete information control. We've seen attempts at greater transparency from the UAE. Every day they publish how many things that they shot down. It seems relatively reliable. Other governments might be following suit. Honestly, I think that, I saw Saudi Arabia stockpiling will get filled up in about 3 weeks. So I would say week one is okay, let's just hope we can pull through this and then try to piece this back to normal. Week two is like, alarm bells ringing. We're going to see more attempts to do things like, I think there were like French and British jets deployed over countries in the region. So there's going to be efforts to try to pull in European nominal allies of the United States who do not want to get involved in the United States war, but might be persuaded financially or otherwise to get involved in the defense of the Gulf states. And then I think like week 3 is into the unknown for the Gulf states in terms of that's a long time for oil production to be offline, or sorry, oil exports to be offline. That's a long time for residents in these countries to be very aware that it's either very difficult to leave or that they can't leave. And that's a long time to be seen by domestic populations as unable to react. I think that up until now, there's still an effort to convey a narrative of we're not going to let ourselves get dragged into this conflict, but the longer this goes on, the longer the chance that either A, there's some kind of horrific mass casualty event in one of the Gulf states, which might just push one of them over the edge in terms of leading an attack, or that just pressure builds up anyway. Like it's been probably the worst in Bahrain, where there's a deep sectarian divide, and the government has the Bahraini monarchy.
Is that Sunni Shia?
And majority Shia country as Iran is, so that's always been a vulnerable point.
Totally.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. Oh, no worries. Yeah, I mean, as a really brief sidebar, you're seeing like the potential for existing divisions in these countries to come out. The Bahraini monarchy has spent the past 15 years trying to just like repress the sectarian discrimination not out of existence, but like just repress any demands for political representation or economic equality from the Shia majority. So there's already been some protests that have been cracked down on. Less so in Saudi Arabia. I haven't really heard any reports from that, in part because some of the changes going on politically in Saudi Arabia in recent years have ameliorated those divides a little bit. But it's these kind of divisions and grievances that are more likely to bubble up the longer that the Gulf monarchies are put in this position.
That makes sense.
Can I follow up on this? One of the big military concerns at the moment is basically this is a race to see who can degrade the other side's munitions fastest. On the Iranian side, they have spent years stockpiling ballistic missiles. They even have things called cities in vast underground bunkers to protect them from American and Israeli air power. I saw one report, by the way, that said that strategy might be backfiring since those are getting targeted and the missiles might not be available to come out, and because the intelligence knows where they are. And so if they bring them out to fire them, they're sitting ducks. And there's maybe a shortage of launchers at the moment, missiles maybe less. But at the same time, you know, Israel is somewhat more immune since it's farther away geographically, and Iran has fewer missiles that can reach Israel. It doesn't have any ICBMs that can hit the United States. The Gulf monarchies are sitting ducks if they run out of interceptors. And the problem is, one, these things take a long time to produce. The United States only produces like 6 to 107 Patriot missiles, or I can't remember if it's missiles or batteries per year. And they're extremely expensive. Whereas this technology that frankly the Iranians have gotten quite good at, the Shahed drones that have been used to such effect in Europe, cost something like $20,000 to $30,000, and they have plenty of short-range ballistic missiles. I even saw a report that Trump reached out to Zelensky for expertise on how to do air defense, since the Ukrainians have gotten much better at this layered strategy of preserving their real good stockpiles of air defense while using things like machine guns to hit these drones. But if they run out of interceptors, and I have seen reports that the UAE is down to 6 days worth of interceptors, and the Iranians start landing some of these punches, do you think that is likely to shift opinion against Iran, or do you think that will build pressure on the leaders of these countries to go to the Americans and say, you need this to stop? Which way do you think that's going to go?
So I think that the Gulf monarchies I wrote like a short piece for Carnegie about this, sort of self-plug, but I think that they're stuck in a dilemma, which is that both sides of this conflict are happy to just crank up the pressure ad infinitum in the hopes that they break one way or another. So even the countries that in the past had mediated for Iran, Oman and Qatar, have both gotten hit. Qatar much more. I think the message is we don't care what you say anymore. We could talk a little bit about the Gulf monarchies' messaging in the run-up to this conflict, but the message signaled is we don't really care what your position was before, figure this out, get Trump to stop. On the Trump side of the divide, the very pro-war with Iran crowd, I think, views the Gulf monarchies as, frankly, to be very clear, views them as vassals of the United States and is upset they are not joining this war and wants the pressure cranked up until they do. And I think what I've been trying to figure out over the past year is it's like a back and forth in terms of whether the Gulf monarchies lobbying or Israel's lobbying on particular policy points seems to get through. And it seems like the Gulf monarchies have been able to basically successfully lobby Trump to sell them things or grant them things. Like Israel does not have a veto over Saudi Arabia getting nuclear technology or F-35s. But at the same time, when U.S. national security aligns with Israel, like the Gulf states just don't seem to really have much of a way in and are all afraid, I think, of threatening consequences to the United States out of fear that Trump will just do something even more crazy. I forget where this question started because I started rambling admittedly, but I think if there are strikes from Iran that start hitting, then the Gulf monarchies bet on we're just going to do something. Maybe it doesn't have any effect on Iran, but we're going to have to do something, and we just message it to try to convey that we're doing something separate from the Americans and the Israelis. I'm sure that they're already trying to bang down not literally, but bang down the White House switchboard, if one still exists, to try to get through and be like, hey, you need to wrap this up. But I just don't think it has any purchase really. There is something I just saw before we hopped on the call. There has been some interesting Iranian messaging around Saudi Arabia, particularly. They keep claiming so on the UAE, Iran is saying, yes, we are definitely striking the UAE. Here's why we're striking the UAE. Same thing with Bahrain. I think the same thing with Kuwait. Qatar, they apologized a little bit. Saudi Arabia, they keep claiming it's not them, whether that's to try to play into the fact that the UAE and Saudi Arabia were feuding before this kicked off, whether that's because they are hoping that maybe they can shift to Saudi Arabia as the go-between for the Trump administration is not clear. And just the last point on that is I've been following where the rockets have been landing. It's hard to get a clear sense of this because, of course, governments are selectively reporting all over the place on this, but it does seem like Saudi Arabia, though there have been a few hits here and there, has been targeted less, and there's been less collateral damage. Aside from kind of the oil infrastructure, which may have been caused by shooting down a missile, we've seen Prince Sultan Air Force Base has been targeted, which hosts American planes, although nominally not being used in this conflict, and the American embassy has been targeted. That could be just because Saudi Arabia is a big place, and it's easier, things are just more spread out. Prince Sultan Air Force Base in the middle of the desert, so you don't run the risk of hitting anything on the way. But it could also be that Iran is, I don't know, taking a lighter approach, if you will, to Saudi Arabia in the hopes they can keep them as a conduit to the Trump administration.
I have a potentially silly question, which is why some of these Gulf kingdoms don't have much military capability, but a couple of them actually do. UAE and Saudi have military capability. Why aren't they hitting back? Is that like a not yet thing, or is something else at play here?
It's definitely not I think there's the question of they could certainly hit back. The question is whether it would do anything that the US and Israel aren't already doing. But I think there's a bunch of other calculations here, which are one, the desire to not be seen as joining an Israeli war. Obviously, the United States is involved as well. Comments by U.S. officials selectively filter into the media environment. Secretary of State Rubio's comments about getting involved, the timing being because of concerns that Israel was going to strike first.
That's right.
That has really, proliferated into a running narrative that this is Israel pulling the strings on the war. Tucker Carlson's videos get subtitled in Arabic and clipped and spread around quite a bit. So there's that, just a general concern about image of participating, a concern that Iran will do worse things, that it's not clear. Is Iran, the number of ballistic missiles targeting the UAE has dropped massively from the first couple days. The question is, though, is that strategic? Are they waiting, or are they just not able to? I don't think that the UAE at present wants to gamble on it just being not able to. It doesn't want to gamble on it being reserve stockpile somewhere.
Yeah, because we
also-
don't know. We don't know how many missiles
Yeah.
they have. We don't know if it's slowing down because they've been degraded so much and can't get shots off, or if they're holding them in reserve. So it would be a big gamble.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
from
and
what
then-
you've told us, they're going to try to get to that third week, right? So they're probably holding in reserve.
Yeah, no, Iran's trying to get to the third week, absolutely. And then I think the other concern is just like we talked more about U.S. inconstancy and inability to rely on them. One talking point from Saudi commentators who are relatively close to the government is we don't want to get into a situation where we join the war effort. The next day, Trump says, actually, America has achieved its objectives, but we look forward to Israel and the Gulf states like shouldering the burden. Because you already see from people, even like Ruben Gallego was tweeting something like the Middle East countries that wanted this war can pay for it. And it's like, okay, which Middle Eastern countries? But clearly not a domestic political loser in the United States to just tell people like, oh yeah, actually, this is somebody else's war now. We're going to leave.
Yeah, and
Totally happen, by the way. It could happen tomorrow.
100%. And
Yeah.
one thing that makes this even more difficult, they really are caught in the middle, literally and figuratively. Like this is, yes, we had the war of last June. This is as openly as the United States has ever acted in cooperation with Israel, particularly in a large scale military operation in the Middle East. Historically,
it's a full operational combo. It's like they're
Correct.
actually interoperating, is my understanding.
which is a break with US policy traditionally. For example, the 1991 Gulf War, it was exactly the opposite. The goal was to keep Israel out of that war because
And they did it.
and they did. And the fear was if Israel struck back at Saddam Hussein, that would fracture the coalition. The Israeli prime minister at the time even said something like, you're treating us like a black sheep of the family, like someone with a social disease. This is the exact opposite of that. And that makes it more difficult for the Gulf Arabs to openly join. Andrew, I don't know if you have a sense about this, but it's historically been a fear of countries like Saudi Arabia that they have a sizable Shia minority population as well, that Iran
has cultivated,
has certain levers that it can pull on. That's a nightmare for them, especially since much of that population lives near Saudi Arabia's oil fields.
Yeah, I have no doubt that there's like a security crackdown or at least heightened surveillance. I do think that they like to give like a tiny bit of credit where credit is due. I do think that they benefited from the fact that like the prevailing like messaging over the past decade has been much more focusing on national identity, trying to wind down religious identity as the basis, or for Saudi Arabia. That has made some more spaces for the discrimination against the Shia minority to be less open. Like the courts, I wouldn't say treat Shia and Sunni as full equal, but are like less overtly discriminatory. I think there was like, I forget the oil minister's replacement, I think is Shia minister now, or is like, so I think that there's maybe less of a concern than there might have been in the past. I think it's like a more broad-facing concern about the population writ large, either if they were to suffer some kind of strike or if they were to perceive, it's like one of these double perception things. If MBS perceives that the population is perceiving him as weak, then I think that's something that would drive him to take military action, even if it's not effective, to be seen to be striking back in some way.
Yeah, it would have to overcome that association with Israel that is very dangerous. So like the stakes would have to be higher than they currently are. Like if a strike killed a bunch of people at once in Saudi Arabia, for instance, then he might be compelled to respond. But
since
we're
talking about, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say maybe you would see like a one and done type response where then it would be like, we bombed the specific site that like targeted us and we've addressed that. We've spoken to the Iranians and now we're like done. But yeah, honestly, I don't know.
I have one more question for you because it raised a bunch of things that don't make a lot of sense in my mind, but it seems like you have a way of solving this puzzle for me. The Washington Post reported a few days ago that MBS, who we should say the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, privately in multiple phone calls had at least been acquiescing to the war or even encouraging the war. In a certain sense, you can make an argument that is logical to the extent that Iran and Saudi Arabia historically have been not on great terms, even if they currently have a kind of détente between them. But given everything you've said about the potential repercussions, if missiles start raining down, that would be a huge gamble. But you had sort of a different take on what happened leading up to the war.
Yeah, so on the Washington Post article, I got into it a bit with the lead journalist on that one. Like someone who's reporting, I generally respect, I think does a good job. This report, though, was like just so out of line with my sense of the messaging leading up to it. I'm prepared to be wrong if in 30 years FOIA still exists. We could figure it out. But so I guess working my way backwards from things, obviously people are probably familiar that Saudi Arabia and Iran have not had great relationships in the past. As a reviewer on an academic article of mine recently reminded me, like back in 2000, I think it was 18, when speaking to The Atlantic, someone likened the Ayatollah to Hitler,
He said he was worse than Hitler.
Worse than Hitler. Okay, yeah. So no love lost at that time. There has been an effort at rapprochement since more recent years, but especially since 2023. There was like a nominal normalization deal signed in Beijing between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There's been an effort to present the kingdom as trying to weigh in against a conflict. I guess the most recent thing where this kind of blew up a bit was that in trying to message to the Trump administration in the run-up to this war, the Minister of Defense, who is the Crown Prince's brother, a guy named Khaled bin Salman, came to Washington, D.C. to convey the party line, so to speak. Khaled bin Salman has the benefit of being very close to the Crown Prince as his full brother, has the slight drawback of not being very good at diplomatic language. Like he was ambassador in the United States when the Khashoggi murder happened and like messed up media relations for the embassy and had to was reassigned. So there was already a controversy over exactly what he said when he was here. There were many reports that he was urging Trump to strike Iran. That was later sort of the accounting I was told by at least one Saudi official and was reported elsewhere was that was actually him making an analytic point of, if you're going to strike Iran, then it should be like, you should be very confident that you can accomplish your objectives. Otherwise, this would drag out. Don't do it. That was probably in turn, there's a possibility that was not phrased particularly well, but I suspect it may have been a similar thing. I'm pretty sure MBS was calling Trump. He may have conveyed something like that, but I'm very skeptical that MBS was calling in on a regular basis saying, why haven't you attacked Iran yet? Because of the headache it is causing now. Sourcing on that article, I try not to be annoying and nitpicky about sources, but the sourcing is for people familiar with the matter, which in that case, I just need to know a bit better. And it just doesn't help that the Washington Post gutted its entire regional coverage base. So what you have now is a newspaper entirely devoted to national security scoops, which means that you're highly dependent on people leaking things in Washington, D.C., which I'm sure these reporters have their sources, but if that's not counterweight against people with familiarity with the region, you can get into this. Notably, when the New York Times did a similar story on the run-up to the war, Saudi Arabia not even really in the picture. It was entirely about discussions with Netanyahu. I guess the final point I'll say is that everything that's happened since leads me to suspect that at least the Iranians don't believe that Saudi Arabia was the prime motive force behind this. Saudi Arabia, honestly, I got to phrase this very carefully, but Saudi Arabia has not been targeted disproportionately. It's been, or it has, but it's been disproportionate in the not being targeted as much direction. My sense is if Iran, I could be wrong, but if Iran truly believed this reporting or felt through its sources that Saudi Arabia had been egging this on, and I'm sure they have ways of finding that out, that they would be targeting Saudi infrastructure much more openly.
Makes sense. And from what I remember, earlier in the year, a few months ago, there was reporting that said exactly the opposite when the Iranians were dealing with those regime-shaking protests. That, in fact, the Gulf monarchies and the Saudis and even the Israelis at that point in time were urging Trump to not do anything to make the situation worse. And some of it was probably also like the old Napoleonic saying, it's like when the enemy is making a mistake, don't get in his way, don't interrupt him. It turns out that Israel just wasn't ready. They needed more time to prepare for this war, needed a few more months. So did the United States, as it turns out. We didn't have assets in the region. So there wasn't much we could have done anyway. But yeah, the reporting at that time was the Gulf Arabs want no part of what's going on in Iran. They want to keep things quiet. And so it doesn't make sense to me that things would have changed like after the Iranians have done the revolts or their protests. That would actually put them in an even stronger position. It doesn't wash for me.
Can I ask the two of you, if I lay out what I see as I think to be Iran's strategy, if you think
Yeah.
that's correct and what you make of it? We've talked about the different points that Iran can press on. Oil, it's not exactly like 1973 since it's not an embargo, so to speak. It's cutting off the supply routes through the straits. I think Trump did announce, I hate that so much of this is being announced over social media, but did say that American taxpayers are now going to be on the hook for providing insurance to tankers and that the US military will escort ships through the strait. Aside from being more expensive, very risky since Iran has plenty of short range missiles it can train on that area. Again, I don't think we know the extent to which those capabilities have been degraded by the airstrikes. I think they understand they're probably isolated at this point. They might get support from Russia and China at the UN, but I really doubt there's going to be meaningful aid given to them.
It's not coming. Yeah.
Yeah, and we can talk about that more if we want to get into the reasons why, but suffice it for now to say I just don't think that's going to happen. So it seems to me like what their goal is to inflict major costs on a variety of actors. I don't really understand why they fired a missile if it was them at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, one of the few countries in the region that has wanted to not that has taken their side to a certain extent, or at least worked to head off the war in the weeks leading up to it. Turkey is a member of NATO with a very strong military of its own, so I don't really understand why they want to pick a fight with them. But leaving that aside, make this the world's problem economically, inflict major damage on its neighbors. If it's holding missiles in reserve, maybe at some point try to inflict greater damage on Israel. I don't think we've seen any major terrorist attacks elsewhere worldwide, but that's something certainly that they might be thinking about.
There was one in Austin, Texas that they're investigating. It's not clear whether that was related or how, but we know that Hezbollah has an international presence.
Correct. We also know they have, to a certain degree, some sophisticated cyber capabilities. Maybe those will make a show. I guess my question for the two of you is, on the one hand, I understand it since they are isolated and facing the regime is in a fight for its life. And so making this everyone's problem has a certain logic. On the other hand, it seems like they're seeking out more enemies by doing this.
Yeah, we just heard from Andrew that, yes, they're seeking out enemies. They're creating enemies. But on the other hand, those enemies aren't going to contribute in any meaningful way. So they must have a good understanding of that. And they're not going to contribute because they don't want to be seen as fighting on the part of the Israelis, generally. And this makes sense based on everything we know about the region. Yeah, inflicting pain and fighting back, trying to establish some degree of deterrence, all of that makes sense. But like, the alternative would be to not fight back and not do anything and just survive, which they need to do anyway. It's like they win if they don't lose.
Yeah.
And they don't lose if their revolutionary government remains intact. And based on everything we've seen so far, there's no reason to think that the revolutionary regime won't emerge from this intact. We're doing our damnedest to kill like various layers of leadership one after the other, but it's like playing whack-a-mole with these guys. We killed a Khamenei, right? The supreme leader. There's reporting now in The Economist that he put himself there to be killed. He was a guy who was 85 or 86 years old. He wasn't interested in going out in a diaper. He actually put himself where he knew that he would be struck and killed and would become a martyr to basically restore the regime ideologically. And it seems to have had an effect. And that is striking to me. What is also striking to me is we're waiting on the official announcement of the new supreme leader. Unofficially, there is some reporting that it's going to be Khamenei Jr. It's going to be a Mojtaba Khamenei, who, to all accounts, is a continuity candidate.
Yeah.
He's a lot like his dad and maybe actually worse.
And even if he's a figurehead, right? If the
Yeah.
institution of the supreme leader is not as powerful as it was under his father, and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the sort of paramilitary organization that is loyal to the office of the supreme leader
And controls half of the Iranian economy.
Correct. And distinct from the regular Iranian armed forces, depending on what happens, this might be an even more hardline government, which is hard to believe. And which Trump said when he was asked what would the worst case scenario here be, that was what he said.
He has said the new guy is actually worse than the old guy. I guess we'll have to see. Before he said that, he was like, we actually killed the people that we preferred to take over. Whoops. He didn't say whoops, but he's like, our second and third choices are dead. Yeah.
You can't make this stuff up. I couldn't believe that.
Yeah. If you're going to do this, like, there's a number of things you'd want to make sure of before going in. One is that you have some kind of force on the ground ready to fight. That's not the case. Like, now we hear that the CIA has been arming the Kurds. That's not going to do it. That's nowhere near enough to dislodge the revolutionary government. Another thing is you're going to want to have a Delcy Rodriguez.
Doesn't exist in this context.
Yeah.
Or
No,
if it does, because it will be a he's not going to win the fight.
No, certainly not. And he's certainly not going to win the fight if he's dead. And whoever Trump was talking about, look, the first day or two of the war, we got reporting that Khamenei was killed along with 40 major regime figures. So he was probably talking about 2 or 3 people on that list of 40 that his intelligence had identified as potential successors that he could do business with. Because that's the desire here. It is not necessarily to get rid of the regime. It's to come up with a more pliable regime. Go ahead.
Good. Yeah, I think that we can maybe come back to this in a bit, but I think that's maybe where we want to talk about Israel's strategic aims versus the United States strategic aims, because I think that's what the United States would like in this scenario. I think Israel is probably fine with an Iran that is like disintegrating into not random, but like ethno states and like infighting among different armed forces that with no figurehead to negotiate with over everything.
Look, short of a stable, free, and democratic Iran that is friendly to Israel and, I don't know, allows Israeli inspectors in the entire country, which is not a scenario I see as remotely likely, it is not out of the realm of possibility that what Andrew just said might be their reach goal. Yeah. That a completely splintered, chaotic Iran that's totally weakened.
State Iran.
Might not be something that they mind.
Yeah.
And this was the argument for the Yemen war back in like 2015 after Saudi Arabia got involved. It was like the stated goals, restore the UN recognized government. But honestly, part of the reason why there started to be such a massive humanitarian toll and international outcry was I think that the goals shifted from let's allow the UN recognized government of Yemen to retake the control. We'll just make sure Yemen can't be enough of a threat to us. And that didn't work out either. Not impossible is happening here as well.
Yeah, I also want to flag like what might be Iran's best card, aside from the moves they've made thus far, is if they can drag this out, which I see no reason why they can't unless you put boots on the ground. And regardless of Trump saying that he's still holding that possibility out, I don't see any world where that happens.
I hope not. When we're talking about the ground that you'd be putting boots on, it's every bit as bad as Afghanistan and worse than Iraq.
I mean, to quote the current director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard from 2020, compared to Iraq or compared to Iran, Iraq was a picnic.
Yes.
Iran,
by the way, she's been completely marginalized.
Yes. Iran is a far larger country, both geographically and in terms of population, 3 times as many people. Also, the terrain is much more difficult. There are major mountains in parts of Iran. You would be kicking a hornet's nest, getting into Persian nationalism. I just don't see that happening. I guess I could be wrong, but I hope I'm not. The Iranians know this. If Iran can drag this out and drag it out in a way that brings costs home to Americans in particular, in terms of blood and treasure, at a time when Trump's approval is about as low as we've seen it and affordability is a major issue here, that might be their best card. And this gets to Andrew's point on if Israeli and American interests diverge, because Trump certainly is going to want to have this be as short a war as possible. The United States has the luxury of being able to come back across the Atlantic Ocean. Israel lives in the Middle East, and the Israelis are not going to want to stop this war until these objectives are achieved. And so that might be Iran's best strategy for driving a wedge between the United States and Israel, and for getting the United States to back off. Because as you said, Steve, they just have to not lose to win.
Yeah. And I want to double click on the failed state aspect of this, because I think that's a really important point. That could be a stretch goal for Israel. I don't think it's a realistic stretch goal because of Persian nationalism, which is a major force. And Iranians, a lot of them would prefer to replace the regime. None of them would prefer the disintegration of Iran in favor of a bunch of warring ethnic enclaves between the Kurds and the Balokis and whoever else. Iran is a multinational state, a multi-ethnic state, and the Persians obviously are very much in charge, always have been, and want to stay that way. So if there is a risk to an intact Iran in a real way, because of the ethnic militias rise up, and we hear the Kurds are coming in now, which seems like a massive error to me, that the United States is going to abet that, because it won't accomplish the goal. It will probably prompt the exact opposite, which is a rally around the Persian flag, because they don't want to lose those areas. Do you agree with that, Andrew?
Yeah, I was going to ask Andrew if he thinks that's a realistic possibility.
Yeah, I guess I think back as well to like Syria. There was like a lot of emphasis on sort of Syrian nationalism. There could never be a divide. Syrian nationalism ultimately strong enough that they can just reconstitute the state even after the civil war went on for about 15 years, 14 years. So it's definitely plausible, but I don't think I guess I don't think it'll necessarily rise to the level of a failed state, but I think of it honestly, if we could draw an analogy, like bluntly, Israel's approach to Palestinian leadership, just to kind of jail or otherwise assassinate anyone that could be a potential negotiating partner and keep things off balance. I'm sure that the regime will steadily reconstitute itself in some way, or some new leadership will arise. But as Galen noted earlier, unless Reza Pahlavi like magically appears and is able to command majority support and like instantly reconstitute like the Pahlavi regime of old, I don't think they're going to be happy with any potential successor.
If that happens, by the way, and I think I've said this on the podcast before, I'm not sure if I like have any use. Like if that were to come to pass, here's what that would mean. That would mean that the United States would have overthrown the government, or helped overthrow the government of Iran with the CIA in 1953. Had that guy overthrown by an Islamic Republic, backed Saddam Hussein against that government in the 80s, overthrown Saddam Hussein, and then overthrown the Iranian government with the son of the guy that was put in the first place, that would be like stranger than fiction to me. But I mean, like,
you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, just to get into the weeds a little bit on this, since listeners might not be totally familiar, I think Iran is roughly 60% Persian ethnically. Something like 10% of the country is Kurds, so somewhere on the order of 10 million people, like 15% Azeri, Azerbaijani, and then various other minorities like the Balukis Steve mentioned. Aside from the fact that countries like Turkey, this would drive them up the wall if the United States were again backing a Kurdish rebellion in one of its neighbors, since Turkey has a large Kurdish population. The way this might work is the Kurds of Iraq generally actually like the United States, since one side effect of US wars with Saddam Hussein was to create an autonomous Kurdistan in northern Iraq. That provides a sort of safe haven for Kurds to go to war with Iran. I think that would be extremely dangerous to have Iran just in that much chaos. Another angle to this is the Baluchis, who are located primarily in southeast Iran and span the border with Pakistan, which just started a war with Afghanistan.
Uh-oh.
So it's not out of the realm of possibility that if the United States gets ideas about backing separatists in Iranian Baluchistan, that's a threat to Pakistan. The way that this could splinter, I tend to agree with you, Steve. I don't think it's likely, but that could lead to, if not a failed state, just widespread instability all over the country.
Yeah, regional chaos. Yeah, that is one outcome. It seems unlikely to me because look, there's no evidence that even though we're hitting the regime with everything we have conventionally, the regime is being meaningfully degraded or destroyed. Not yet. The bombs are still falling. So it is possible that the smoke clears and it's, wow, everybody's dead. I guess we need new leaders now.
It's almost like they've understood that this was a possibility for decades and had plans in place for this contingency, and that this was an argument people made about why this would be really risky to do.
Yes. My reporting, reliable reporting, indicated that Khamenei saw this coming, which is why he put himself in a position to be killed and martyred. Number one. Number two, he had everybody in the government, like high ranking in the government, designate a line of 4 successors. And then each successor was supposed to designate their own successor. So that makes it pretty difficult to decapitate the regime because they have this gigantic flowchart basically of all these people that just keep coming up. It's been preordained. And I don't know how far into that flowchart we are. We have a lot of bombs and missiles. It's possible we can work our way through the entire flowchart. I don't know how long that's going to take. It also seems unlikely. And to your point, it's like if the regime knows this is coming, there's a lot they can do to harden themselves. And they've done it.
I'm going to make you answer the question you asked, which is, if the Israelis want to keep fighting, whether that's because they are fine seeing Iran in chaos or they have more objectives, and Trump gets tired of this, what do you think the outcome of that interaction is going to be? And ultimately, if the regime does not collapse, are we now talking about, to use the phrase I don't really like, but the Israeli strategy of mowing the grass? It's just now, instead of doing it in Gaza and the West Bank, we're doing it with Iran indefinitely.
Yeah, I think that kind of my fear from a viewpoint of wanting there to be less war in the world in general is a fear about that, of just like expanding things outward. And but I think in terms of stuff gotten wrong, I guess I anticipated more of a series of things like last summer, where you would periodically have a bunch of missiles fired and then fired for a week, claim victory, and then move on. The thing is that the challenge is that the people who've been warning against doing this for a long time have said that eventually you will hit a point with the regime where you will start something that you can't stop because they're no longer interested in being mown on a recurring basis. And unlike Hezbollah, a militia within a multi-ethnic state, unlike Hamas, one Palestinian faction in one part of the Palestinian territories, Iran is a sovereign nation of millions of people with a large economy, which may underperform relative to a Western European economy, but it's still a lot of money and a lot of material. And I think that, honestly, it's a good question. I don't know if Trump, I don't think also going into this, Trump understood that he could make decisions that he couldn't then just reverse. Because the challenge is now is that he can say, okay, we're done. But I don't know if the Iranians think that the Iranian leadership thinks that they're done. That's not going to move U.S. bases out of the way. It's not going to, I don't know, even setting aside the Arab Gulf monarchies, it's not like something he can just turn off now. And I imagine you wind up seeing something on a very rapid pace scale. There's no way politically things continue as they are for the United States and Israel until September that the Pentagon was talking about. Republicans are already starting to get concerned about the looming fallout for the midterms. This is still going on in September. That's practically when early voting starts. So I think that probably, again, to use kind of a 3-stage thing, right now we have close coordination to the point where Trump is saying that you should pardon Netanyahu so he can concentrate fully on the war. There will
Right.
then be like an infighting period in which you're getting more and more leaks out of the Trump administration about actually how like feckless, awful, and divergent Netanyahu is, that is going to morph into some extremely nasty anti-Semitic content from the right. And then like at some point there will be like a like Eisenhower in 1956 style break where Trump will, I think, remind Israel that like actually the United States can cause a lot of trouble very quickly. Like I think we saw that in terms of the restarting of the war on Gaza
Yep.
last year. Trump got a ceasefire, so he looked like the candidate of peace when he got in. Got the weird AI generated graphic of the Trump Gaza City.
That was so weird, dude.
And then it was like Netanyahu kicked it off for a time. The whole spring was like, yeah, Trump's like, I guess this is fine. By the summer, like even people who did not like using the genocide word at the outset of the content were like, that's getting to be the kind of word we feel like we need to use here. And then by fall, it was like, okay, actually, we're going to just, you're ending this now. But again, that was a situation where you really only had two actors. Like Hamas could fire back, but and has much greater capabilities, and Iran gets like a much stronger vote over what happens. So I imagine if this drags on, that Israeli-U.S. tensions will bubble up to the surface.
Look, it's a point those of us that study war and peace never forget, which is the enemy gets a vote, a core principle. I want to flag two things there. One, typically when the United States goes to war, at least at the very beginning, there tends to be a rally around the flag effect. And then if
Haven't seen it.
if the war grows unpopular, it'll decline from there. We're at the start, and it remains to be seen how things go. But at least for the moment, it seems like many of these objectives are being reached. And the polls I've seen tend to skew towards somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% of Americans opposed. Now, that is
Not good.
breaking largely along partisan lines, although most independents are with the Democrats against it. And if it starts to go badly, that number could tick up pretty quickly. The second thing that I want to, I guess, use as a segue, as depressing as it is, into the discussion on the U.S. Israeli element of this. I just want to echo something Andrew said. Something I'm very worried about is the potential for some sort of anti-Semitic reaction within the United States. This is something that U.S. officials have worried about going back to. Andrew referenced Eisenhower's basically ultimatum to Israel in 1956 to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula during it was during the Suez Crisis. Yeah.
Right.
You can go look at primary documents from that period where people like the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, say, like, this could lead to a wave of anti-Semitism. I think Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State for Kennedy and Johnson, writes in his memoirs concerned about that. My work has covered Henry Kissinger, very worried about this during the 70s. So that's something I'm quite concerned about, particularly since we're already not living in a great moment for that. And the thing that I think we need to talk about is we've referenced Rubio's comments a few times. If you actually watch that full press conference, this was immediately seized upon as Israel dragging the United States into a war. If you actually watch the whole thing, that's not quite what he said. He said that explains more of the timing. Now, even that is a little, my understanding is it's the CIA who knew where Khamenei was, and that intelligence was shared with the Israelis. So to an extent, it's like you share intelligence and then the Israelis choose the timing. I could understand why maybe that irked some people in the administration. But the thrust of Rubio's comments was this was going to happen eventually. The fact that the Israelis were going to preempt just explained why it was happening now. The bigger story, in my opinion, is what the New York Times has reported, which, if you understand Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's views on this, is not all that surprising. Like, he himself said recently, he's been working on this for 40 years.
Long-term project.
Yeah, no, but he understands Israel's not strong enough to confront Iran on its own, and that only the United States has potentially the military capability to do that. And this is something he's been discussing with Trump pretty much since the outset of Trump's first term. And it seems like Trump initially was not willing to do it. Then June happened and Trump saw an open goal, got involved. But the detail in there that I found most interesting was the New York Times reported on February 24th, so just a few days before the war began, that Rubio and the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, were briefing congressional leaders. And I think the language in the article was basically like, look, we have to act in concert with Israel because if the war gets going, we're going to get targeted regardless. And so we might as well land the first punch because we know the Israelis are determined to act. So similar to Andrew talking about that Washington Post article, we probably won't know for some time what exactly the story is here. At a minimum, we know this is something Netanyahu has wanted for a long time, going back to the second term of George W. Bush when they were pressing for the US to provide bunker busters, and certainly during the Obama presidency. So it certainly feels like he was pressing his case, and I'm not sure we know how much that affected Trump, but I think this is a key piece of the story we need to talk about.
Yeah, one thing I worry about is like Netanyahu's gotten what he wants, but he's not going to get what he needs. What he and Israel actually need are a non-nuclear Iran. And what I fear is that all of this is just going to result in a North Korea style nuclear Iran. And it may take a little while, but now I do not see, again, depending on the results of this war, where all of this shakes out, and assuming that the regime doesn't change in any meaningful way. And I think that's not a safe assumption, but a decent assumption based on what we're seeing at this point in time and extrapolating out from what we are likely to see going forward. We see a more hardline Iranian regime, us against the world. We see a closed regime, and we see a regime that no longer has any reason to trust negotiations or to conduct negotiations. We see a regime that somebody has tried to assassinate, literally. Didn't work. So now we're going to get the bomb. Nobody's going to try to assassinate the North Korean regime ever.
Right? We should say, by the way, the Iranians also credibly tried to assassinate Trump, and
they did. They did, and it didn't work. We did assassinate Khamenei, or I guess killed him in a war. Potato, potato. Now his son's in charge, and we recall the two Bushes in this country. W's grudge against Saddam for trying to kill his dad. That's a thing.
Yeah.
And so why wouldn't the Iranians just turtle up and go nuclear when all this is said and done?
Oh, I think assuming they feel that they can achieve that, there's no question.
Yeah.
That that's their goal now.
And
like,
I think
I think we should all clarify, like, all of us find this regime loathsome.
Yes.
The fact is it exists, and unless we get lucky, will continue to exist.
Yeah. We came at the king and missed. That's what it looks like to me right now.
And well, it seems like it's just like a... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Please.
Yeah, it just seems like in terms of the foreign policy commentary in the United States, it just seems like it always has been and currently is now, again, a clash between people who think that there are no constraints on U.S. power and that the fact that someone is opposed to the United States is sufficient reason to go all out to eliminate that person. And those recognize that there are constraints on U.S. power and there are consequences for using enormous amounts of weaponry and U.S. dollars to, I don't know, grind into submission like a third-tier regional power. And I think this gets at why public support is so low. Like, you're explaining like a three-step chain of, they have ballistic missiles that could be used to constrain global trade that will then lead to bad outcomes, and why they're struggling to, why they may achieve those goals, but if they can't achieve them quickly, they're not going to get a lot of credit from the public.
No, they're going to get the opposite. So it's yeah, assuming that the administration in Israel don't somehow land the plane with a regime change or come up with a Delcy Rodriguez. And as of right now, today, as we record, there's just no reason to think that's what's going to happen. It could happen, but it doesn't seem like things are headed in that direction. they're going to head in the other direction. And at the end of that path is an Iranian nuclear bomb sooner or later. We can keep mowing the grass. We can keep bombing their facilities. We can slow them down. They're just going to disperse it. It's just going to get harder and harder. They're going to use Pickaxe Mountain, right? Which is what we talked about over the summer. Galen, it's this new facility that is impregnable to anything other than direct nuclear strike. It's like you have to
Or
melt
I
a
don't know
mountain.
if you get special forces in there somehow, but that seems like
Then it's boots on the ground, and you're doing
Yeah.
boots on the ground.
And that, as much as we now know how thoroughly penetrated Iran's security services have been, even that seems like a pretty tall task. I do want to say this is a major gamble for Trump for a whole
Yes.
bunch of reasons, like a crazy gamble. I think this is a much even more enormous gamble for the Israelis. They live in the neighborhood, and it's unclear how this is going to play out. And Israel obviously has a nuclear arsenal of its own. I can understand very much why they would be very concerned about a nuclear armed Iran. The United States is far less vulnerable than Israel is to that sort of threat, and the United States still doesn't like it. Going about it this way, particularly if we end up learning that those negotiations were actually going well. And I don't have enough insight into that. I did see one report.
Right.
It's a little shaky as to tell, but that the Iranians had agreed not to stockpile enriched uranium, that they just wanted to be able to claim the right to continue to enrich it, but not stockpile it, in which case you would not be able to build up enough to build a bomb. I don't know how much stock to put in that, but as we've now discussed at length, if this is not going to solve the problem, the Israelis are now stuck in a pretty tough situation over the long term, unless this mow the grass strategy is viable. And for the reasons Andrew laid out, I just think that's a very tall order. And sorry, one more point on this. Like Trump said, yeah, they were about to be able to reach the United States with their missile program.
No, they weren't.
It's categorically not true.
Yeah.
Okay. The estimates are that they were about a decade away from having ICBMs. So as far as this affects U.S. interests specifically, that's just something we need to refute.
Yeah. Andrew, like, what's your impression of Israeli public opinion on this right now? I understand that the Hamas atrocities and the Gaza war, like, changed a lot of minds within Israel and unified Israel on the need to get even more aggressive in the neighborhood. But is anybody within Israel making the type of argument that Galen's now making that you're aware of?
I'll be fully honest, I've been having like mental bandwidth issues in the past few days and have like over-indexed on trying to follow like even stuff in the countries I already vaguely am supposed to know about. So I haven't been following this closely. I do think that there's probably broad support now. I think in terms of things that I know that I don't know, I don't think we've like fully absorbed. I'm just vaguely aware that like Israeli public opinion on these issues is just so far out of the realm of what I am familiar with in the United States that I don't think it's like the domestic public opinion will be very different than the situation in the United States. This has been framed by Netanyahu and others for decades as like an existential threat to Israel. So it's probably easier to get support for these military operations. In the United States, people have certainly demonized Iran. There's not a ton. There are people maybe demonstrating against the war, but there's not a bunch of people like rushing to the defense of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But at the same time, it's like there's a question of why. Like if this was missiles, the Bush administration, when they wanted to get people to like pivot from understanding that Afghanistan was directly related to 9/11 and now we need to invade Iraq, there's at least an awareness that like they needed to give people some kind of narrative to make that cognitive leap. Whereas now it's just like we're negotiating with them. Actually, we decided we can't negotiate with them anymore. And that'll convince the already convinced of the people that are definitely going to back Trump. But it's just, anyway, sorry, I've drifted back to US public opinion as well. But I think it just speaks to the fact that going back to some of Galen's points, there's also the boomerang effect potentially for this on the left as well. Like, admittedly, there have been like over predictions of some kind of Israel losing public support and that affecting how presidents act. hard to really point to that so far. But when you have the mainstream California governor candidate, Gavin Newsom, just kind of, hey, I just wanted to make sure that I did a podcast referring to Israel as an apartheid state, like it's not a great position.
I missed that. That's crazy.
Yeah. By the way, at odds with his longstanding positions on Israel. And I think Andrew's right. I think that was the sole purpose of that, was like, just want to make sure this is on record.
Yeah.
Right now.
Well, my opinion of Newsom is he's an opportunist, so it's not super surprising.
I mean, just to answer your question, Steve, my impression is this is broadly popular among Jewish Israelis. Obviously, a fifth of Israel is
Arab Israeli.
Palestinian.
Oh yeah.
I don't know what the numbers are there, but I suspect support much lower. But I think Jewish Israelis like overwhelmingly support this.
I think that they understand the nature of the gamble.
I think they probably do understand it. This is one area where, as someone that lives, at least for the moment, in what you could argue is the most secure country in the history of international politics,
Right.
my perspective is necessarily going to be different. My sense of Israeli foreign policy for some time, whether it's on this or dealing with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, is they don't really see political solutions to these things necessarily, or at least deem the costs of those political solutions as too high. I'm not going to get into the Israeli-Palestinian dispute right now, but like, my sense of how the Israelis view this is that either you get regime change, and I think that probably the Israeli public does understand very well that that's a major difficulty and probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
But this is not a problem that you can just sit by and accept. Now, the part I'm less able to explain, again, we had a nuclear agreement on this. It was an imperfect agreement. Even people like me who supported it at the time readily recognize it did not touch their ballistic missile program.
Or the proxies.
Or did not redress their broader behavior in the region. There were sunset clauses. Nevertheless, it shipped out 97% of their enriched uranium stockpile. It had robust inspections in place. The Iranians were in compliance with the agreement. So not a perfect agreement by any means. For me, looking at the current situation, who knows, maybe we'll all be wrong and this ends up being a smashing success and the Pahlavi regime is restored in Tehran. This strikes me as much riskier than the deal that was in place. And
yeah,
who knows, maybe if more details on these negotiations that were taking place when the war started come out, I'll feel even more strongly about it. But the thing I understand less is this does not strike me as something that you can settle purely with a military solution. Ultimately, over the long term, it is something that can only be addressed with a political solution. And
yeah, and
this
unless
war
the military
has
solution
removed that.
Yeah, unless the military solution generates the political solution, but that's just really hard to do. That's like trying to smash like a glass coffee table in such a way that it assembles a beautiful sculpture. And it's a tortured metaphor, but out of destruction needs to come democracy. It's like without boots on the ground. I don't know.
Now, like, I'll just make the case, and then I want to hear Andrew's view on that. You could, in a certain sense, understand where the optimism comes from, or at least the guarded optimism, right? As awful as October 7th was for Israel, probably the darkest day in the country's history, they have been on a real winning streak in the region since then, in a purely military sense. I actually think at the international level and politically, you could argue what's happened in Gaza has really been a setback for them over the long term. But in purely military terms, they did seriously degrade Hezbollah. They did seriously degrade Hamas. The strikes in April 2024, October 2024, and June 2025 inflicted major damage on the Iranians. They managed to get the United States to fight a much more intense war with Iran. Maybe it's a case of thinking the military really can take care of some of these things, at least in the short to medium term. But like I said, it's an enormous gamble. Yeah. Andrew, I want to hear your view on that.
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question? Sorry,
Like, do you think the Israelis like think about this that way? Or
right.
yeah.
So I'm teaching the course on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Obviously, there's the potential to just like over-index on whatever I was just talking about. But we were talking about the aftermath of the 1967 war as well, and like Golda Meir's obsession with defensible borders, and the very like strong conviction that you can't negotiate with Arab states at all. All you can do is seize territory and hold. And I wonder if we're going to wind up seeing something similar here. If this doesn't go well, if there's and then like you had got Menachem Begin, who had his own issues but had a very different worldview on that question, do you get a different leadership open to alternative ways? Because yeah, right now it seems like, hey, we've had success after success. People said you can't degrade Hezbollah to the point where it changes the situation inside Lebanon. Oh, we managed to seed a bunch of pages that blow up among them, and now maybe we are going to remake the political map of Lebanon. Probably not long term, but yeah, I think it's similar to the. I think the view really is like hasn't failed us thus far. Why not go in now and take care of it? I think that I think Trump on a very I think that's like more on a strategic thinking level for the Israelis. For Trump, I think it's just a very personal level that he's done stuff in the past. He doesn't remember the stuff that didn't work out in his mind. So the sequence in Trump's mind goes, they said don't move the embassy to Jerusalem. I moved the embassy to Jerusalem and the Arabs didn't riot, like to use crass language. They said don't assassinate Qasem Soleimani in a spectacular manner. I did, and the Iranians shot down a civilian jetliner instead of an American military plane. They said don't kidnap the president of Venezuela. I did, and everyone was fine with it. They said don't go to war with Iran, and so I went with a special military operation instead. But
Right.
going into it, and then I think that was also encouraged by people who could only view Iran in one dimension, which is what type of regime will there be afterwards, or how quickly can we kill people or blow things up inside Iran, and didn't reckon with what many other people had pointed out, which is like this debacle that then it opens up, which is that if you can't end this in a week, you're in for a lot of trouble. And you have to reckon with things that military planners who focus on the tactics of the first opening salvo don't really think about, which is, oh, like now Iowa farmers are unclear how they're going to get enough fertilizer to make sure that they can grow corn because all of the fertilizer being taken off the market that's produced in petrochemical plants inside the Persian Gulf is going to have knock-on effects. And then I'm sure there's tons more things like that they're not even thinking about.
I mean, we haven't even mentioned, like, from a grand strategic lens, this has really moved the US from the pivot to Asia to the pivot from Asia. Like this is supposed to be the theater that the United States is downgrading its focus on in order to move more forces to the Indo-Pacific.
That it's a tortured argument, and I sent it to you, Galen, to see what you thought. The argument is like this actually does connect to the Asian theater because China depends on oil going through the Hormuz Strait, and they're making more deals with the Iranians, yada, yada, yada. It's okay, except that this is we can declare victory and go home, but this is not going to solve the problem. It's going to make things worse and make it impossible for us to like just ignore the issue.
Look, I appreciated you sending it to me, and I can't say that I didn't enjoy reading it. I found it interesting. My problem with it is twofold. One, like to a certain extent, if you're Xi Jinping, you're like, oh, the United States wants to get into another major conflict in the Middle East.
Fantastic.
Go right ahead. And the second piece is my sense of Chinese policy in the Middle East is no thanks. If the oil keeps flowing, and I take the point, but I don't think anyone's talking about the United States like seizing all of the oil in the Middle East, and oil's traded on a global market.
They're not, but it's like we seized control of oil production in Venezuela pretty effectively. So maybe the thought was, oh, we can seize control of the Iranian government somehow and do business with them. And it's completely the wrong frame and analogy to apply to a radically different situation. But that may have been part of how we got here in Trump's mind. I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much. But my
speculation on Trump is people were telling him you can be the guy that finally
solves this problem.
Yeah.
The guy who's in a hurry to establish a legacy and he's looking for wins. and he's been on a streak. But my answer to the winning streak thing is like the operative word is streak. Streaks end. And to me, this is, oh, I'm like 8 for 8 from three in an NBA game, and now I'm going to shoot from half court. And there's just no way I'm going to miss. It's like, dummy, you're going to miss. Like, this is literally 10 times harder than anything you've attempted to this point. And you're
Go ahead.
It's just kind of, it's like the thing where it's, ooh, yeah, maybe term limits on presidents were a bad idea, because now I was elected primarily out of resentment over high prices and a vague sense that the incumbent president was spending too much time on foreign wars. It's year 2 of my presidency. Setting aside even the tariff stuff, what'll really go over well is like driving the price of the most strategic commodity in the United States higher and higher, while also getting the United States involved in a very difficult to end war. That even if he does, this is the thing that I don't like, sorry to be too excited, but like let's say it goes great. Let's say he can somehow declare some kind of victory off of this. I don't even think it benefits him that much. Like,
no.
People are like, why did you do that? What does it gain us?
It's an asymmetric downside bet.
Yeah, Steve, you made this exact point. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like he's not going to get any pop out of this. And it's also the downside. It's asymmetric downside. It's like that's a bad bet.
Also, let's say he does get, let's say all 3 of us are wrong, and this is like a smashing success. I do think there is some truth to the argument that the regular laws of political gravity don't apply to him. But typically, like, Americans don't vote much based on foreign policy to begin with, unless it's highly salient. And it's usually only highly salient if it's going poorly. And if it goes well, it tends to be fleeting. And I would say that trend has only been strengthened by the hyperpolarization in the United States, right? Remember when Obama announced that he had killed Osama bin Laden, and he got like a 5-point bump that had just disappeared 2 weeks later. So this is different than that, but I suspect you're both right that like the political upside is not nearly as great as the political downside. Can I ask since we've got Andrew, I want to ask one more thing that ties a few of these things together. Like, leaving aside for the moment if Israel is mistaking military success for political victories, and I can't escape the temptation as a security studies person to reference Karl von Clausewitz, like, war is a continuation of policy by other means. Like, you only use military force to achieve political objectives. Is there, particularly if this goes badly, could this do something like wreck the Abraham Accords with the Gulf states? Or do you think those are now pretty much solidified?
Yeah, I think either possible. Like, what was it? Lindsey Graham was saying, like, Saudi Arabia is going to rush to normalize after we defeat Iran. And I was like, both outcome, like all 3 potential outcomes, either like victory goes horribly or is just bad in the middle. None of them are like, now it's time to normalize with Israel. Okay, so you successfully smash Iran as a power. Great. You have removed the like motive force pushing Saudi Arabia towards Israel over the past decade. And they're like, thanks. We're going to enjoy not having to worry about Iran anymore. Let us know if you get around to Palestinian statehood. It goes badly. Saudi Arabia is like, yes, we're not particularly interested in normalizing ties with the country that brought all of this on to us. And also we're dealing with like vague grievances over like how we manage this. And if it's in between, then there's just like a constant reminder of, great, you're the reason we have like periodic drone strikes that are keeping us from diversifying into another economy. And then that's going to breed conspiracies that it's all part of an Israeli plot to undermine Saudi greatness. Even for the UAE, I think prior to this, actually, you'd seen the UAE taking steps to be very open about its willingness to coordinate with Israel on other goals in the area. But this is like the #1 area where they are just like completely and diametrically opposed. The UAE certainly benefits from an isolated Iran, because then the IRGC has to sluice all of its funds through Dubai, which is great if you're running like a company in Ras Al Khaimah or something, or Dubai, or if you just like benefit from Iranians owning a bunch of property there, but not at the risk of losing your entire economic model. So I think that this is, unless the United States is going to threaten all of these countries that like now they need to normalize with Israel, which is not clear that's going to work, or if we're going to be in a position to do so after this. I don't think like Bahrain and the UAE break ties with Israel, but they certainly won't be playing them up, and the remaining countries are not going to be rushing to join.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Yeah, like they've just upset the apple cart, like in a really, really big way, and things were moving in the right direction. And now we've got interceptors flying around and shrapnel raining down, and this is not part of the plan. The glittering metropolises on the Gulf, right? And the diversified economies. This is not what is wanted. We're trying to escape from this frame.
And to add a somehow more depressing note on this conversation, like in my view, it still remains the thing that would most help Israel with this problem is a settlement with the Palestinians. And I think at this point, I deem that as less likely to happen than the former Shah of Iran's son marching triumphantly into Tehran. So this is a tough problem.
Yeah, tough Raz, as they say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I guess it's all fixed now.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Good. We solved all the problems. Obviously, we're going to be talking about this again. Andrew, it's awesome to have you back on the show. We really appreciate your expertise and schooling on the Gulf monarchies and the rest of the region. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, man. Well, welcome back anytime. That was awesome.
Yeah. And
thanks for having me.
We're all dismayed about what's happening, but we're going to keep talking about it. And this has been another episode of Global Tantrum. Thank you, everybody.